December 15, 1944. 0543 hours. The Pacific dawn bleeds over a restless sea. Off the coast of Luzon, the horizon flickers with distant flashes, silent for now, like a storm waiting to speak. On the decks of American battleships, sailors grip the cold steel rails. Below them, loaders and gunners move with mechanical precision. A low hum fills the air, hydraulic pumps primed, targeting systems aligned. Then, the order comes: commence firing. The ocean convulses. Massive steel barrels tilt skyward. A single salvo erupts. 10 miles of water ignite with thunder. The shockwave rolls across the sea, slamming against the Japanese-held shoreline. The sky itself seems to tear apart. Seconds later, the shells land, each one the size of a car, each weighing more than a small truck. Entire sections of coastline vanish in a bloom of earth and fire. Onshore, Japanese soldiers are thrown from their trenches, dazed, their ears ringing with a sound that feels biblical. One survivor would later describe it as the voice of a mountain collapsing. Another said the ground opened like a mouth to swallow men. These weren't bombs dropped from planes. They were shells, armor-piercing giants hurled from ships floating miles away, far beyond the reach of Japan's coastal guns. For the first time in the war, many Japanese defenders faced the terrifying truth: the enemy's ships were firing projectiles heavier than anything in their arsenal. The Type 88 coastal gun, Japan's pride, could lob a 200-kilogram shell. The American shells that fell upon them that morning weighed over 1,200 kilograms. The difference wasn't just technical, it was psychological. It was the sound of a new kind of dominance. Smoke rolled across the water, curling around the great silhouettes of the American fleet. USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, and others, steel citadels moving with grim authority. Each carried 9 16-inch Mark 7 guns, capable of launching a shell 25 miles, farther than the eye could see. Each shell could pierce over 30 inches of armor plate. It was industrial might forged into fury in Japanese observation posts. Officers watched through rangefinders as their fortifications vanished. Communication lines went silent. What confused them most was the range. Enemy ships, not visible. One Japanese coastal observer radioed before his signal cut out. They couldn't comprehend how a shell so massive could be fired from so far away. It was as though the Americans had bent the rules of warfare itself. Aboard USS Missouri, men worked in rhythm like an orchestra. The gun crews, dozens per turret, loaded 2,700-pound shells using hydraulic rams. Powder bags followed, 6 of them per gun, each weighing 110 pounds. The entire ship would tremble with every blast, plates rattling, and instruments vibrating as tons of metal roared through the barrels at 2,500 feet per second. You could feel it in your bones, one gunner's mate recalled. The whole world shook. On the receiving end, the effect was catastrophic. Pillboxes melted. Bunkers collapsed inward. Trees, bridges, and supply lines disappeared beneath churning craters the size of swimming pools. The Japanese defenders, veterans hardened from years of brutal fighting, had never seen artillery like this. Their counter-battery fire fell short by miles. Their coastal guns cracked under stress. Even those who survived the barrage spoke of it with a WWII in Tokyo. Reports trickled in from scattered radio messages and desperate couriers. Commanders debated whether the Americans had developed a supershell. Rumors spread that these shells were filled with a new explosive compound. Engineers at the Kure Naval Arsenal pored over fragments recovered from the beaches. What they discovered was simple and devastating. It wasn't chemical magic. It was industrial scale. The Americans had simply built guns and shells so large, so precise, and so abundantly produced that the Japanese war economy could never match them. In truth, the seeds of that moment had been planted years earlier, in the factories of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Virginia, where steel mills poured out the massive barrels that would define the new age of naval warfare. Each Mark 7 gun took a year to manufacture, bored and rifled to within thousandths of an inch. Behind every blast at Luzon stood teams of machinists, metallurgists, and ordnance engineers who had turned industrial art into deadly science. As the bombardment continued, U.S. battleships shifted their fire inland. Their shells struck troop concentrations, supplied dumps, and airfields. The timing was perfect, each salvo coordinated through radar spotting and aerial observation. The Japanese defenders found no pattern, no pause, and no mercy. For every shot they fired back, the Americans answered with WWII midday. The coastline was unrecognizable. What had once been a defensive stronghold was now a cratered wasteland. The survivors stumbled through smoke and rubble, unable to hear their own voices. Many didn't know what hit them. Some believed they had been bombed from the air. Others thought the sea itself had exploded. When word spread that it was the battleships, the great floating fortresses of the U.S. Navy, doing this from miles offshore, disbelief turned to despair. These were not the same battleships that Japan's admirals had envisioned dominating the Pacific. Once, they too had believed in big guns. The Yamato and Musashi, pride of the Imperial Navy, carried 18.1-inch guns, technically larger than any American weapon. But by late 1944, those ships were symbols of a dying doctrine. They were built for fleet engagements, not shore bombardment. They were too few, too vulnerable, and too far from fuel. The Americans, in contrast, used their battleships as instruments of precision terror, floating artillery batteries whose purpose was not to duel other ships, but to erase islands from maps. As dusk approached, the thunder quieted. Smoke drifted across a sea littered with debris. From the American decks, the sailors watched fires burning on the horizon. They knew the landings would come next. For them, it was just another operation. But for the Japanese soldiers who survived that day, the memory would haunt them. Many wrote in diaries afterward of the impossible shells and the crashing sky. In one surviving note, a Japanese artillery officer recorded, "We are powerless against this thunder. Even the earth hides from it." It wasn't hyperbole. The shelling of Luzon marked a turning point, not because it introduced a new weapon, but because it showcased the terrifying reach of American firepower and production. Japan had entered the war believing in spirit, training, and courage. The United States entered it believing in engineering, steel, and scale. Now, as those colossal guns cooled in the evening light, that difference had become undeniable, but the secret behind their devastating power, the technology that allowed those massive guns to fire with precision across miles of sea, was still hidden from Japanese intelligence. It wasn't just the weight of the shells that shocked them. It was how they hit exactly where they were aimed. That secret would reveal itself in the next stage of the campaign, a fusion of innovation, radar, and human ingenuity that turned American battleships into instruments of surgical destruction. And when Japan finally learned what guided those monstrous shells, the shock would cut deeper than the explosions themselves. The secret was not in the shell, it was in the sight. While Japanese observers at Luzon marveled at the power of the American barrage, what they couldn't see was the invisible web linking those colossal guns to a new kind of battlefield intelligence. Behind every thunderous salvo, a radar pulse had gone out first, scanning, locking, and feeding back precision data that made impossible shots routine. On the command deck of USS Iowa, officers bent over glowing radar screens, their green light flickering on anxious faces. Operators tracked coastal outlines and enemy batteries through rain and smoke, long before they were visible to the naked eye. For the first time in naval warfare, battleships no longer fired blind. Each 16-inch gun was paired with a Mark 8 fire control radar, an engineering masterpiece developed by the Naval Research Laboratory, an RCA. It could track a moving target at over 35,000 yards, even at night, even through storms. This was the American edge, not just size, but science. The radar sent continuous readings to the ship's central plotting room, deep inside the armored heart of the vessel, where a crew of technicians translated electronic pulses into firing solutions. Analog computers, massive mechanical brains of gears, dials, and gyroscopes, calculated wind speed, shell drift, ship roll, and target range. Within seconds, corrections were fed back to the gunners. It was an industrial symphony of math and steel, all to ensure one thing, that every shell found its mark. Aboard USS New Jersey, Chief Fire Control Man Harold Barton watched the scopes dance with light as the coordinates stabilized. He shouted the range, and the gunnery officer replied, "Solution set, fire." The next volley screamed into the night, guided by invisible precision. Far across the sea, Japanese defenders watched the horizon erupt again. They had no radar, no night optics capable of competing. To them, the accuracy was supernatural that Japan's naval doctrine had once prized the intuition of its gunners, the art of spotting impacts through binoculars and adjusting by instinct. It was a skill honed through decades of training. But against radar-directed fire, human eyes were obsolete. Their shells landed wide. Their counterfire wasted ammunition. One Japanese commander, bewildered by the accuracy of American battleships firing through darkness, wrote in his diary, "The enemy must have a god guiding their guns." The reality was more human and far more powerful. The Mark 8 radar was only part of the system. Its data was fed into the Ford Instrument Company's Mark 1A fire control computer, a mechanical analog computer weighing nearly 3,000 pounds. It could process the roll and pitch of the ship, the wind direction, and even the curvature of the Earth. Engineers at the Ford plant on Long Island had worked day and night to refine its internal gears to micrometer precision. What they created was a device capable of solving differential equations faster than any man with a slide rule. IT wasn't glamorous work, no battlefield glory, no medals. But without those engineers, the massive guns of the U.S. Navy would have been blind giants. That precision was tested to its limit on January 6, 1945. The U.S. fleet approached Lingayen Gulf, the final gateway to retaking Luzon. The Japanese had fortified the coast with hundreds of artillery positions and hidden caves loaded with ammunition. The weather was abysmal: sheets of rain, dense smoke from earlier bombardments, and poor visibility. Traditional gunnery would have been impossible. Yet the American battleships pressed forward, their radars sweeping the coastline like searchlights made of sound. That USS Missouri locked onto a coastal battery hidden behind a ridge. Spotter planes couldn't see it, but radar could. At 0830 hours, Missouri's turrets turned, slowly, deliberately. 3 guns elevated in unison. A burst of flames split the horizon. Seconds later, the radar operators watched the echo vanish, the target obliterated. That day, the American battleships fired over 16,000 rounds of 16-inch and 5-inch shells. Nearly every major Japanese gun emplacement was silenced before the landings even began. The loss ratio was staggering. U.S. Navy damage was minimal, and Japanese positions were nearly wiped out. To the Marines storming ashore, it felt like divine protection. To the Japanese troops trapped beneath the bombardment, it felt like Judgment Day. In the aftermath, Japanese officers examined craters and fragments, desperate to understand how the enemy's aim could be so deadly. They found no clues, only smooth, precisely cut shrapnel and the eerie pattern of perfectly aligned impact zones. Every shell found its home, one surviving lieutenant later remarked. It was not random fire. It was hunting. The irony was cruel. Japan had once led the world in optics, producing some of the finest naval rangefinders ever made. But while they perfected glass, the Americans mastered electricity. The radar-guided gunnery of 1944 and 1945 represented a revolution that rendered even the most skilled visual spotting obsolete. Even the mighty Yamato, Japan's floating fortress, could not compete. Its great 18-inch guns could hurl a heavier shell, yes, but they lacked the precision to match range with accuracy. When it finally faced American forces in 1945, radar-directed carrier bombers and gunfire overwhelmed it before it could even see its enemies. The age of blind giants was over. The radar itself was only part of a much broader transformation. Shipboard communication networks allowed multiple vessels to share targeting data in real time. The Americans called it task force coordination, but in truth, it was an early form of networked warfare. The radar aboard USS Iowa could share bearings with USS New Jersey, allowing synchronized salvos from ships miles apart. To Japanese spotters, it looked like chaos, gunfire coming from everywhere, landing everywhere, all at once. But beneath that chaos lay method, mathematics, and machine precision. As the campaign pressed on, the effects multiplied. Radar allowed for night bombardments, where once darkness had provided cover. It enabled counter-battery fire in storms, where once gunners were blind. It even allowed ships to fire over mountains, relying on radar reflections and pre-mapped coordinates. The Americans had turned the sea into a giant, invisible weapon. By early 1945, Japanese morale began to crumble. Soldiers dug deeper, building caves instead of bunkers. They stopped using radios for fear of detection. "We cannot see them," wrote one officer, "but they always see us." The psychological toll was immense. Entire units refused to man exposed artillery positions. Commanders spoke of the iron thunder that never misses. What radar had done was erase the boundary between human error and mechanical certainty. It made warfare mathematical. Cold, absolutely. The geniuses behind it, men like Samuel Silver and Robert Morris Page at the Naval Research Laboratory, were never household names. Yet their inventions redefined the balance of power in the Pacific. By merging radar, analog computing, and gunnery, they gave the U.S. Navy a precision that turned massive guns from blunt instruments into scalpels of destruction at Lingayen Gulf. That precision broke Japan's coastal defenses in less than 2 days. The landings that followed met scattered resistance. The soldiers who survived the shelling were half-deaf, half-blind, and wholly demoralized. The Americans walked into positions already silent, and as the smoke cleared, Japanese officers began to understand the full meaning of those distant flashes at dawn. It wasn't just that the enemy's shells were heavier. It was that they knew exactly where to put them. The thunder they had heard at Luzon wasn't just power. It was science, calculation, and cold American engineering. But the story didn't end there. The same technology that guided those 16-inch guns would soon leap from battleships to aircraft, to submarines, to entire fleets. What began as radar on steel decks would become the nervous system of modern warfare. And in the months to come, it would help finish a war that had begun in the dark by illuminating everything. By the spring of 1945, the echo of those great guns still lingered across the Pacific. The bombardments at Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa had proven a new truth of warfare. Whoever could see first, and strike precisely would control the outcome long before the enemy fired back. The Japanese had learned this too late. The Americans had fused radar, computation, and firepower into something greater than the sum of its parts, a machine of absolute certainty. When U.S. Marines landed on Okinawa in April, they did so behind a curtain of fire more intense than anything the Pacific had yet seen. For 7 straight days, the battleships Tennessee, Nevada, Idaho, Missouri, and New Mexico pounded the island without pause. The air filled with the rhythmic percussion of their 16-inch guns, each salvo timed by radar, plotted by mechanical brains, and coordinated by radio. The result was terrifying efficiency. The shoreline was churned into dust. Japanese tunnels collapsed before the soldiers inside could even hear the shell that killed them. From intercepted communications, U.S. intelligence noted the growing panic in Japanese ranks. Officers described constant shelling without warning, day and night. Others simply wrote, "There is no safe place." The mental toll was immense. Men stopped sleeping. Ammunition crews refused to work in the open. Entire units deserted their firing posts to hide in the jungle. The psychological impact of radar-directed bombardment was nearly as destructive as the explosions themselves. In post-war studies, Japanese survivors recalled that their fear was not just of the shells, but of the silence between them. The Americans could stop firing at any moment, then strike again with perfect accuracy minutes later. It felt to them as though the ocean itself was alive and watching. What they didn't know was that even in the pauses, American radar continued to sweep the island, tracking every movement, mapping every gun, and predicting every counterattack. Behind those operations stood a vast logistical miracle. The U.S. industrial machine fed the fleet with an unbroken stream of steel, powder, and radar components. At the Norfolk and Puget Sound yards, damaged ships returned from the front and emerged weeks later with upgraded electronics and recalibrated fire control computers. Thousands of factory workers, men and women alike, kept the arteries of this system flowing. The radar assemblies were wired by hand. Thousands of connections per unit, tested, packed, and shipped across oceans. Each anonymous worker played a part in the thunder that shook the Pacific. The result was strategic dominance. By mid-1945, Japanese coastal defense was no longer a barrier. It was a target list. American battleships didn't just bombard. They conducted preemptive destruction eliminating enemy artillery before landings began. The radar-directed precision made amphibious warfare predictable and safe. What once required weeks of attrition now took days. But this precision came with a human cost that no engineer could calculate. The accuracy of the bombardments left little room for surrender. Entire Japanese positions were vaporized before a white flag could even be raised. At Okinawa, thousands died without ever seeing the enemy. The same technology that saved American lives also erased countless others, blurring the line between efficiency and annihilation. In the aftermath of the war, U.S. investigators studied the effects of the bombardments on Japanese morale. Reports described a recurring theme: disbelief. Captured officers repeatedly asked how it was possible that their guns could never hit, their fortresses never survive, and their ships never find the enemy. Many assumed the Americans had developed supernatural targeting or even homing shells. When the truth was revealed, that it was radar and computation, they reacted with silent astonishment. Interrogations after the surrender revealed the depth of the shock. One Japanese naval engineer said, "We fought with courage, but they fought with science." Another added, "Their machines knew the ocean better than we did." The contrast between the two nations' approaches to warfare, spiritual endurance versus technological mastery, had become the decisive fault line of the conflict. American strategists recognized this as more than a wartime success. It was a glimpse of the future. The lessons of radar-directed fire control became doctrine. Naval academies rewrote their training manuals. Future fleets would no longer rely solely on line-of-sight gunnery or human instinct. The new era belonged to sensors, data, and coordination. Within months, that evolution accelerated. The same principles that guided battleship guns began shaping the next generation of weapons. Radar was miniaturized and installed on aircraft, submarines, and later, guided missiles. The analog computers that once filled battleship plotting rooms became the ancestors of digital control systems. What began as the Mark 8 radar and Mark 1A computer on the Iowa-class ships laid the foundation for the missile guidance and targeting networks of the Cold War. The strategic philosophy changed as well. The U.S. Navy realized that dominance no longer depended solely on armor or firepower. It depended on connection. A ship isolated was vulnerable. A fleet linked by radar, radio, and computation was invincible. This concept, networked warfare, would echo through the decades, resurfacing in the Vietnam War and Desert Storm, and even into the modern era of satellite targeting. But for those who served aboard the great battleships, it was more personal. They remembered the vibration of the deck plates beneath their boots, the smell of cordite, and the glow of the radar scopes in darkened compartments. They remembered the teamwork, the precision, and the strange comfort of knowing that every movement, every calculation, was part of something vast and unerring. On the USS Missouri, now anchored peacefully in Tokyo Bay by September 1945, the same guns that had thundered at Luzon and Okinawa stood silent. Their barrels, once instruments of destruction, now pointed toward a horizon of peace. As Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender on her deck, few of them realized that the very ship beneath their feet symbolized the triumph not just of might, but of method. The war had ended where it began, with ships and science deciding the fate of empires in the years that followed. Veterans of the Pacific would speak of the bombardments with mixed feelings, pride in their effectiveness, sorrow for the devastation. Engineers returned home to quiet lives, their contributions forgotten by most. Yet their work had changed the world. Every pulse of radar, every gear in a fire control computer, and every perfectly machined barrel had pointed humanity toward an unavoidable truth. Technology had become the ultimate weapon. For Japan, the lesson was bitter but transformative. Within a decade, the same nation that once fought with spirit alone rebuilt itself through industry, electronics, and innovation, the very tools that had once defeated it. The radar that guided American guns would soon guide Japanese ships and aircraft in peace. Out of destruction came imitation, and out of imitation, rebirth. As the sun set on the age of battleships, the echoes of their thunder faded into history. But the principle that guided them, that precision could replace brute strength, remained. It shaped not only naval warfare but also the entire military philosophy of the modern age, from the gun decks of the Iowa to the command rooms of Cold War submarines. One lesson endured. Victory belongs not to those who shout loudest, but to those who see first. The American battleships had proven that even the heaviest shell in history meant nothing without the invisible hand that guided it. And when that hand belonged to science, the outcome was inevitable. The last entry in a U.S. Naval Gunner's Journal captures it best. Written on the eve of peace in 1945, "We didn't win because our shells were bigger. We won because they never missed."